Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm Holly Ainley, Head of Programmes and Creative Engagement at the National Centre for Writing, here at Dragon Hall in Norwich, UNESCO City of Literature. In this episode of The Writing Life, we focus on the evolution of the noir genre in crime fiction. NCW Programme Officer Ellie speaks to American author Margot Douaihy, who stayed with us on a writing residency in autumn 2023 in our Dragon Hall Cottage. Margot Douaihy is the author of several titles, including the brilliant mystery novel Scorched Grace, the inaugural title of Gillian Flynn Books. Douaihy is originally from Pennsylvania, now living in Northampton, Massachusetts, where she teaches popular fiction and literature with Emerson College. Ellie and Margot explore growth and changes in the noir genre, and how crime novels can be well equipped for generating social commentary. They discuss how alienation is conveyed in crime fiction, as well as the representation of queer identities. So now, I'm delighted to hand over to Ellie in conversation with Margot Douaihy. Enjoy.
Hi, Margot. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Ellie. I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of this podcast, and I loved my time with the Writers' Center.
Yeah. Well, we loved having you, and I thought actually we would start with a quote that I pulled out of your Noirish lecture that you gave last week in Dragon Hall. You said something that really stuck with me. You said, "Noir is a dark heart of innovation and culture." Can you expand a bit more on that? Can you tell me what you meant?
Absolutely. So when we think of life, of course, so much of how we communicate with one another is through the form of storytelling. Even if you just asked me how my day was, I would probably share some kind of story or anecdote. And we have so many different kinds of stories and forms of stories. Noir, in particular, is a very unique and yet fluid, sometimes elusive and hard to describe form of a story. But like a poem, you know it when you see it. And so noir has these hallmarks and touchstones of no way out, and all characters are fallen or compromised, and disorientation and destabilization. And I think it's so important. I think we keep gravitating towards noir from the earliest incarnations in post-war scenarios, tales of trauma and bleakness and decay and distrust of power structures, right up till today, when we have eco-noir and various forms of noir that really just give us a moment and a way to say, how do we make it through these hard times? Mm-hmm. It is a dark heart of cultural innovation in the sense that it continually gives humans these forums to explore why we are drawn to making bad decisions. Humans facing the worst temptations, causality, what drives us to these moments of desperation and where the triangles of trust keep shifting. And so, they're hard stories sometimes, and at the end, it ends in a bit of a bloodbath or a double cross or a triple cross. There is so much utility in just facing some of these contours of the human experience. They're deeply existential. They're philosophically engaged. And I think that we, just as a human species, we like to explore almost like a dream where you work out some of these unpredictable moments of life. And the storytelling form that's just so captivating and seeing where we can push the terrain. And so I think time and time again, you see the little fingerprints of noir, whether it's pop culture, pulp stories, massive phenomenon such as, Twin Peaks, for example, which has some roots in noir, weird noir, strange and captivating dances with temporality. So time and time again, in unexpected ways and places, we see the beautiful darkness of noir asking questions. Really that's what it's all about, is asking profound and generative questions.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the notion of needing to ask a question in an abstract way and then leaving someone else to maybe give an answer, most likely not give an answer, which is what normally happens.
Exactly.
Oh, I love that. I think as well, what you say there about the characters being kind of intrinsically imperfect. They almost have to be imperfect, particularly the protagonists for crime to work. And I love it. You know, they're not the traditional hero most of the time. They're not even any kind of hero. They're kind of just driving it. And then normally they have this rootedness in like a repressed inner turmoil, which makes them so captivating and so really interesting. But what I was also thinking was that maybe that sort of almost accidentally makes them a really suitable vehicle for exploring queerness, which is something that you do, of course, in Scorched Grace. If we're kind of thinking about queer theory being kind of historically shaped by like an anti-normative sensibility, and then queerness is pushed to the edge, and we've got the norms being the status quo and domination and all this kind of thing. But I've read the book, and that's given me some of that space and some of these questions that you're talking about to think about this. So what I was curious was, when you started writing the book, what was your initial reason for choosing crime and then also for choosing a queer protagonist? Did it feel natural?
Absolutely. It felt almost inextricably linked in a sense of almost, choreographing a particular piece of dance for a site specific experience. They felt so inextricable, and also something that I, as a writer, wanted to write through my exploration. So having an anti-hero is certainly extremely flawed, an extremely complex protagonist within an anti-hero lineage of a sense, in terms of my deep love and respect for the hard-boiled school. And also noir, of course, where you're following along these characters who just cannot get out of their own way and kind of create the chaos that they then run away from, but then run toward. So it's just something that I felt that I needed to explore in a mystery. So it does occupy the form of a whodunit, but it's really drenched in noir signatures, in that sense of all the characters are compromised. There's really a deep sense of distrust that pervades the narrative cartography from every angle. There are double crosses, there are triple crosses, and there's just, people grappling with a tremendous amount of loss and repression, and how that pokes up out at the edges and kind of even makes some of the characters, question the very roots of everything. But the queerness is probably the most important piece for me, because I wanted to really expand, the queer storytelling crime fiction experience away from easy categories of, good or bad, really just try to collapse that binary. And I think, as a corrective in some regards, perhaps some creators or even the audience itself, we want characters that are people we can look up to, people we can root for, we can strive for, as a bit of a corrective for the really just wretched homophobia of the past, where the queer character might be either the punchline or the corpse. In Raymond Chandler's, works and oeuvre, to be called, even intimated as being gay, is the worst offense.
Yeah.
So, but for me, queerness deeply inhabiting crime fiction does mean that, really to humanize, we have to make our characters quite nasty. And that doesn't, it doesn't negate an intersectional expression. In fact, I believe that intersectional crime fiction and noir does give our characters spaces to be their nasty, flawed selves, because this world is hard. The world is a hard world. And to create narratives that feel substantial, surprising, perhaps even with authentic touch points that we can put ourselves in, even if we're not robbing banks and going on the run, like in Elliot Chase's Black Wings Has My Angel, or James M. Cain, or Jim Thompson's The Killer Inside Me. So these really wild crime stories with characters making terrible decisions through bloodlust or whatever it might be. But I think that queerness insists really on, these full expressions of characterization. And even if that is sometimes difficult, I think, again, there's a real utility in seeing characters in all of our shades, and it can be quite humanizing and to me very satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with that need almost for the bad history. I remember having a chat a long time ago with Hugh Lemmy, who does the Bad Gays podcast and the book as well. And yes. he says that's his whole philosophy, is a very similar thing, that it's so important to not only know the history of the kind of the quote unquote good gays, yes. because you've got to expect that moral messiness and that diversity in morality for everybody. And so also it's strange though to think about equality being acknowledgement of the bad bits, and that's often last to come.
Yes, I totally agree. And there was such a strong response to when Gillian Flynn wrote The Gone Girl. You have this really just awful both narrators of Amy. Terrible. But there's something so bracing about the depth of the characterization. So as both a reader and a writer, I really appreciate these experiences because of those, the fullness of the experience, the kind of torridness of it all. Yeah. And it can be very immersive. And so, it seems like it would be antithetical to want to create a queer crime story in which all the characters are quite quite haunted and really difficult and really terrible. But this is our little world that we've chosen to write into. And so I think that it's incumbent on me as a writer to really take it as far as I can go.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. I know you've also said in the past about why it's so important that art reflects who we are and who we want to be. And when we're talking about crime, that's almost funny in a lot of ways, because as you say, we're not robbing banks, or at least, I mean, if you are, don't tell me, keep that quiet. But it's so intrinsic to crime, because we're talking about the whodunit, the who killed Professor Plum in the study with the candlestick. That's why we're there. It's why we're reading, or at least it's why we picked it up to begin with. It might not be why we're reading by the end, I suppose, for a lot of books. And I've heard crime writers talk a lot about this search for truth, and they're not talking about the whodunit. That's not what they're talking about. I think they're making a reference most likely broadly to the genre, to noir, to where it's headed.
Yes.
Do you agree with that? Do you think that crime writers are looking for truth? And what does that mean, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think we're in a remarkable place right now of evolution, where we have more voices in crime fiction. We're decolonizing crime fiction, where what's actually occurring is so beautiful, because subtext becomes text. And in so many ways, we get a moment to ask, what is crime? Is it, yes, of course, poor Professor Plum, who bid it in the library because of some perpetrator with the candlestick. Yes, that's horrible, actually. And in fact, I think really there's so much more to explore about the fascination with crime and murder in general, because it is, of course, the greatest loss that cannot be reversed. I do think you're absolutely spot on, and I agree that it's a moment of inquiry as to, is inequality a crime? Is violence, of course, a crime? Racism is a crime. Transphobia is a crime. So you have this sort of matryoshka doll of questions about crime itself, power and powerlessness, voicelessness, lack of agency. Some families with dynastic wealth versus, the scrappy, sleuth or whatever it might be. You have these tremendous opportunities all within a gripping, pacey story, because that's really also very important too. I think State of the Nation polemics have enriched the books that I love the most. And I think they're there from the very beginning. And I know there's some spirited debate around it, but even in the early stories of Hammett and Chandler and Spillane, you have crooked cops on the take, and, people that are judges kind of looking the other way. You have mobsters and all of that. But I do think it's a moment of really getting to reframe questions of institutional power and authority. And I thank, the crime writers of color and a group started by Walter Mosley and Kelly Garrett in the US for really championing this beautiful work, because when you love genre, you're a fan, you love it. You want to read books that, that really scratch that itch or tick the box. But then you get all this just incredible enrichment within a great mystery or a great noir, which sometimes doesn't even include mystery at all. So it's great to see all the different subgenres at work too.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. I think it was Megan Abbott who also a few years ago, I'm not sure exactly when, but she gave the Noirich lecture as well. And she said, as with everything in literature, something is present before it's quite articulated. And then someone identifies it, gives it a name, and the unconscious suddenly becomes conscious. And that's what you're getting at. And as a big crime reader, as well as a crime writer, it's interesting to hear that there are these changes coming in. There's this evolution in crime, as there should be in kind of all literature. But crime is distinct because it has all these tropes. It has the things that we know are going to be there, that the private eye it might be, or the urban setting is another kind of big one. And do you think that those tropes are something that it's important to have and to grow within? Why did you do that rather than say, smash them, be done with them, and kind of start over? What's the advantage, or not, if you'd say?
Absolutely. And I see writers taking, varied approaches with it in terms of setting a mystery in a moon of a moon, so it's almost like a speculative mystery. I think really beautiful things are happening on the edges and in the interstices, of course. For me, tropes are a language that we speak. They're almost like shorthand or signposts that we can speak to one another. And so in my case, the lone wolf, the adult braggadocio, swaggering lone wolf, I love that trope. I absolutely adore it. And of course, I bristle against it. And I resist the sexism of the early incarnations of that trope. But I love it, the chain smoking kind of whiskey drinking. So I took all of the things that I think are really fascinating and generative about that trope, because really when you strip it down to its essence, it's about alienation, and it's about theater and performance, and how when you feel absolute terror inside and you feel extremely lonely, that you push people away and you act like a jerk. And, and I get that. And I think that's really something extraordinary to honor. And, the world can be such a septic world. So you got, your trench coat and your hat and the rain and the mean streets. So I took all of that and I imported it into a tatted up nun, 33 years old, who makes a countercultural move to move from this world of being this, sort of an icon in her own head, of being this post, band, a guitar teacher who spends all of her money on tattoos, and makes that move to move from that life to a somewhat monastic life as a progressive but Catholic nun in an order in New Orleans, and holds that space of being both an insider and an outsider, and of the world, but completely outside the world. And I think they're really interesting societal instruments to explore, for so many reasons, because I think alienation and connection, the need for human connection is something that is really important for me to explore in storytelling. So that trope was perfect to really examine and then kind of subvert, but also honor. And I think that for a variety of writers, that's a great little bit of a dare, almost like sitting down to try to write a sonnet and write something new within the familiar.
Yeah. Yeah, within the familiar. I like that. It's crime more than other kinds of fiction. There's some really normal things about it, but then normally the actual plot is, I would hope, for the most part, quite far from the writer's life for their own sake, very much so. But am I right in thinking that you, growing up, that you had experience at the Catholic Church and things like that? You did. So how was that to almost bridge your worlds through fiction? How did you find that process?
Extremely healing and very, very reparative. And I'm a huge advocate for art in general as a very reparative and grounding experience, but also, again, crime fiction, because it gives us these ways to explore some difficult material in a way that we have control over. So I did grow up in the Catholic Church. I was baptized and confirmed and was a practicing member for decades. And it's a huge part of my family's identity and expression. And at the same time, I felt quite othered and alienated myself, for all the reasons that one can imagine. But yet it's still there. It's a huge part of me that I don't feel like I need or want to excise, even though I'm no longer a practicing member. And so when I would have these experiences of sort of walking by these beautiful churches and looking at the stained glass and feeling almost anxiety. And for a number of years, I thought, I want to do something. I want to write something that does create a bridge between my past and not only my present, but my future. And, really Sister Holiday emerged in that space of being someone, a character that could create a kind of a queer future, in a sense of you can inhabit the life that you want to inhabit despite the dogma or despite the fidelity to some kind of a doctrine. And so she's, of course, this is fiction. And so she is an out queer person and then still does take this provisional vow. So it's not exactly how it works.
You mean that's not your plan for the future?
I know in certainly other denominations of spirituality, faith, and religion, you can have a spouse, and but not in this particular denomination, which is what was really important for me to use as material. But I also wanted to explore what sexual identity could mean within a celibate person, and how what even these notions mean for us as queer people and just humans in general. So I do find, after I do a reading or book signing, a lot of people will come up to me and say, I'm also a lapsed Catholic. And there's something about the guilt that doesn't quite leave. But, it is on the holidays, on, midnight mass or Easter or certain times of year, there's just like almost this desire for kind of exhale or peacefulness. That's not necessarily like a rejoining, but just a sense of peace. And even in the actual chaos of Scorched Grace, I try to create a world where this dialectic exists, where you can be anything you actually want to be. You do, you're not hurting other people, and that's also part of it too. And yes, she's a character that I've built, but I've mentioned this, I think at Noirich, whenever I walk by a church now, I'm like, I wonder what Sister Holiday is up to inside, getting up to, rather than having an actual panic attack.
And that is progress.
Highly preferable.
Definitely. Much easier to get on with the day, I imagine, at that point. Yeah. I mean, it definitely comes across in Scorched Grace. It's filled with conflict. The whole book is filled with conflict, but never does the conflict feel like she's conflicting with her faith, which is interesting. It's really solid, and it's a bit of an anchor for her, but also as a reader, it's definitely an anchor. When you've got this lone wolf character, this very classic noir character in that way, and she's defiant and she's snarky and she's edgy, and so you could worry, as with other protagonists, that there's kind of an insecurity or an instability lying deep down, and there are elements, but not to do with her faith. And I liked that. I've not seen that before, and I think that's the whole point: is trying to write what we haven't seen and what we'd like to see, and try to build something. So yeah, absolutely. But the actual thing from the whole book that struck me the most was the number of sentences about how sweaty everybody is all the time in New Orleans, and how hot it is. And I have a friend who studied there for a year, and it checks out. I can confirm it checks out. And kind of jokes aside, it's wonderful because the city's alive. It's completely alive. It's almost a character in the book. And even though I do think that it feels very special and very tailored to Scorched Grace, the idea of a city being alive and being a character, that is another crime trope. That's classic in lots of crime. Why cities? Why do crime writers love the city? What is it? What's so captivating there?
I think it's well, thank you so much for your beautiful read on that. I appreciate that. And thanks to your friend as well. Yeah, I think generally, I'll speak for me, and then also what I love about reading cities and specific sense of place in crime fiction is that it's contextual.
Yeah.
So much of crime fiction is about context and causality. And so when the city or the urban setting itself is within your crosshairs, it becomes something else to watch, something else to scan, and gives you crucial information, about the mentality and mindset of each character, and can really act as a Rorschach test. So some characters complain about the heat mercilessly, and some, like Ravoux, and then some are just, they kind of roll with it. And so can do ways to tease out of different aspects of character. And also, I love feeling and mood in works, when you can walk away from a Scandinavian noir and just feel bracing cold and the kind of clenching of muscles.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real success. And so I wanted to strive for similar dizzying kind of heat stroke, fever dream within the world of this book, because really the meta narrative is about burning and incineration and fires left unchecked that will devour everything in their path. And so with the heat being a character, the city itself, the quirky characters of the city and the heat being almost one and the same, but then also the diversity, because cities are not monoliths. You have characters like Prince Dempsey living in a trailer, an old hazardous FEMA trailer, and then other people living in great wealth and lushness.
Yeah, definitely. I like there's something lovely about being a writer, and you'll have your points you want to make, your questions you want to raise, but then that kind of intrinsic love for the details of the line, for the delicateness, for the construction of a real vibe, for lack of an aesthetic, perhaps is a more accurate word. And I wonder as well, is there art in however we want to define it? Is there art in every crime book? Does there need to be art? What's that difference between a book or a book of fiction or a book of crime and a book of art? Where do they overlap? What is the relationship between trying to tell a story and trying to kind of create a piece of art? What does that mean? You're welcome to get as academic with that one as you like, because those are some big terms in there, but I'm just curious what you would say.
I love it. I'll start with the little kid version of myself reading a book in a tree, which is whatever it is, whatever aesthetic is chosen, whatever telos of the project, does it give you almost implant a dream in your mind and something that you can escape into or feel a sense of wonder about, wondering about it, or creates wonder in you. And so for me, even just the sleekest, slickest page turner that is just total plot points and no character, no dexterous line work, nothing at all, but just like he picked up the gun and he shot the gun and the gun was shot, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
If it can open a new door that wasn't there before, then it's achieved, and in my mind, there is a real artistry to joining things together so quickly that you're racing through it. But I do think, it's a funny thing. Cause like, I don't know about you, but like my taste really varies very wildly. I love all sorts. I love everything, I love very oblique odes to nothingness and like, very intensely philosophically driven pieces. And then also, really plot driven, just bangers, because I think it's really fun to see the variety, and depends on the day too.
Yeah.
I hope that kind of addresses the question, but I think that's the other beautiful promise of crime fiction, is that you can take it wherever you want to take it.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there is one answer to what is art. I think it's maybe one of the most intriguing yet horrible questions.
What do you? I want to know what you think. What is it? How would you define it, or even not necessarily define it, but I guess describe it?
How would I describe art? Oof, it's an interesting one. Outside of my work in literature, there's a lovely project that happens with some old friends where we review art with quotations in any form that we can find. The wackier, the better. And the idea of the reviews isn't to say, is it good? Is it bad? The idea of those reviews is to say, how did you feel? What did it bring to mind? All of this kind of thing. And I think perhaps that is, if I have an answer, if I have a review that I would write, then I would probably qualify that thing as art. I think art can be really god-awfully bad, and I can still gain something. Even if that is just a good laugh, I can gain something from it. And sometimes what I'm looking for is a good laugh. So I may go for for the bad things those times. But it's a big question. And I like that art doesn't have to be very big all the time. It can be very, very small.
Absolutely. I love that too. That's so great.
Yeah. Let's look for wonder. Let's look for good laughs and open doors and all those things. To take a slight detour, crime books have a lot of violence. There's a lot of violence in them. That takes different forms depending on what kind of crime we're dealing with. But in these books where there's lots of social commentary, we've spoken about the evolution of the genre and how we're seeing more kind of intersectionality come into it. And these are big social commentaries. These are big driving forces. How do you balance that with violence? Those are quite opposing things sometimes. Does one speak to another? How does a writer look to balance those things when they're constructing their narrative?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And it's a really important one too. And this answer, of course, is from a person who, when I do see any kind of roadkill, I look at it through my fingers and I cry, and I would give a funeral to every little deer or bunny that I see perished. And yet here I am writing somewhat grisly stories of loss and death and violence. Again, not to be, get too academic, but I think rationale is important. And so do look at the both personal and societal value of tragedy, as described, say, folks like Aristotle and Julia Kristeva, who wrote a really wonderful treatise called The uh, Power of Horror and Tales of the Abject, and how that there is a real benefit to exploring, some of the hardest stuff in life. And sometimes violence will narrativize and vivify the hardest stuff of life. Because then you can move through it. You can close the book and you can walk away. And sometimes, you don't want images stuck in your mind. But I think that as a writer, for me, it's not about gore. It's not about bloodshed necessarily. It's about that feeling of, the breaking or the cleaving or whatever it is. Give almost this sense of relief. And so the violence that I have read in crime fiction that has felt particularly transformative is, in the works of Cormac McCarthy, Jim Thompson, to a small degree, Patricia Highsmith, and really the contemporary writer that I think is a real artist of what I would call stylized or aestheticized violence is S.A. Cosby. So Razor Blade Tears, All the Sinners Bleed, Blacktop Wasteland, remarkable tales, All the Sinners Bleed, tale of a black sheriff who's on the hunt for a serial killer, but then you have these extraordinary social comments about racism and white supremacy. And the violence, again, gives you this space to release, to have catharsis. And I think catharsis is very important. Move it through the body, get this kind of turbid energy out. And so I do that, and I feel everything my characters feel. So in the sequel to Scorched Grace, there's actually quite a lot of violence, and it was hard to write, but I tried to hold the space of an authentic experience. So, whether it's the person getting hit in the face or the person doing the hitting, it's, again, we're capable of all these articulations with our bodies. And so to write through it is an interesting exercise, but one I never take lightly, ever. And I try to do responsibly in that sense of always calibrating between what is too much and what is not enough to create an authentic narrative moment. But I do think that it's something that different characters, really have wildly different takes on. And people like horror, for certain reasons, but I think that it can communicate in a similar way where it can give you that kind of almost like, what's it called? When you go into the ocean on a most freezing day on New Year's Eve, and you survive it, like euphoric. Yes, euphoric. So on the roller coaster, and you feel your insides, your viscera, like moving around the body. And I think we can do that in art too. And it's more than just a jump scare. It actually can be almost reparative.
Yeah, it's like it's almost something not, I don't know if palpable is the word, but something you can't quite put into words. It just the body needs occasionally. I like that. Yeah.
And so much of our life is like this, right? For our listeners, I'm just going to my head, basically. When you're writing, you're just, or, if you look or stand at any street corner and just look, and you'll just see people staring at a phone.
Not facing the world.
Yeah. And I think a moment of a fight, a fight scene that can be very unusual and not a cliche, but can give you just a more full and three-dimensional experience of what a character is actually having to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really true. There's an assumption there as well of interaction with the reader if it's a book, or I suppose the audience if it's a film, or in a kind of noir in another form. The piece itself, the art itself, excuse the pun, is not Bible, but it's giving you that entry to kind of do what you want and interact how you want, rather than telling you. It's just going to give you some things and you see what you want to do with them. Yes. Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah. And the other thing is, you've mentioned it a couple of times, and we were talking just before I hit record, so sorry listeners, but you are also a poet. You have written a lot of poetry before the Sister Holiday series. And I wonder how you have found, perhaps for this, I'll bring it back to queerness and writing queerness and exploring otherness, which I think links to that alienation. There's lots of themes here. What's the difference between what you found in writing the poetry and what you found in writing crime fiction? What are the differences in what those forms allow you to bring to the table, what they've allowed you to explore?
Oh, definitely. I guess I treat it like different brushstrokes that a painter might need. Some are thin, some are thick. Some create light or hold light, and some hold shadow. And I think writing across different forms and genres has given me a sense to explore. Some of the poems that I write are just these little vignettes or moments in life, and even as small as a tiny, like a little makeup brush or something like that, where you're kind of using that. And then, of course, the prose is just a larger scale and a larger scope that encompasses more causality and more thinking about the inner workings of a piece of art. So then thinking through scenarios, thinking through character arcs, through queer storylines in ways that are very satisfying. So I feel like I'll always write both. And of course, the other day I was just scheming about what new poetry book I want to create because we're always just reinventing what that means for ourselves. And for me, what I love about a poem is just the stopping of the world for a moment, where you just almost have to stop and just absorb and be amazed or feel that whatever it is, this incredible eureka moment. And then with the fiction, it's this propulsion and almost wanting to desperately move through it. So like there's the one that gives you pause, and then there's the one that thrusts you forward.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's really wonderful. I agree. I mean, I can't say I'm a big fiction writer myself, but I'm a fiction reader and definitely a big poetry fan, and completely agree with the holding of the moment, the absorption of the moment, and the fiction kind of releasing and letting it run amok, hopefully.
Yes, please.
we hope.
I'm a listen derby, yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. And you've mentioned a couple, just to kind of wrap up, you've mentioned more than a couple, actually, writers and books that have been inspirations for you, that are obviously the ones that come to mind when we're talking about these things and the evolution of noir and crime generally. But if there's a writer listening, so there's a writer listening who's a crime writer, they're wanting to get into it, but they are angling to try to utilize the genre to explore something different or move in a direction they want to, or really make it their own in whatever that looks like to them. You've mentioned Walter Mosley and others, but who would be your top recommendations for writers, for books, even places to be looking for inspirations?
Oh, well, definitely the Noirich Festival, which is the perfect crime writing festival, which is true, lives up to its name in 1,000,000% beyond that. So for me, I would say if you're new to the idea of crime writing, or let's just say hypothetically you're from a poetry background and you're interested in exploring and opening up the aperture a little bit, I would, of course, strongly recommend the work by Raymond Chandler, like The Long Goodbye, The Big Sleep, Farewell My Lovely. He's a poet in so many ways. And some folks disagree with the fact that he is hard-boiled because his language is so poetic. I, of course, strongly believe that he's hard-boiled because of the voice and character and the grit of the character, and also the self-effacement. Starting with him, and of course, keeping in mind that it's difficult material, it's highly problematized. You will have your fair share heaps of sexism, racism, homophobia, and to keep that in mind as you read that when these works were written, who they were written by, and still I think there's tremendous value in them, and they're remarkable texts. And then I would say the work of the 90s, which would be considered almost neo-hard-boiled or the counterweights. So Walter Mosley, Sue Grafton, Sarah Paretsky, and then in noir, of course, James M. Cain, Elliot Chase, and modern writers who I think are writing glorious noir tales. It's one of the funniest books that I've read in the past decade. My Sister, the Serial Killer by by Oinken Braithwaite. And it is a sleek novel. You can read it in. I love noir novels that are around that 200-page or mark in terms of, just kind of flying through it. And My Sister, the Serial Killer is so iconoclastic. It is so funny, and yet and dark and hard, and yet it holds this beautiful ode to family and the bond between siblings. It all in this just real ripper of a pacey, beautiful read. And then I'll flag one more book that I think straddles the lines and really embodies genre blending. And I mentioned this in the Noirich lecture, is a book called White Horse by an Indigenous Native American writer named Erica T. Worth. And it's a mystery, but it's also what is considered new wave horror. But it's really noir, it has some noir signatures as well, in the sense that you just do not know who to trust. It's a very disorienting world. The boundaries are quite porous, and it's really an interesting inhabitation of the mystery space. And so I think it's just such an exciting time to be a crime fiction reader and writer. And just those are just a few of the recommendations I have. And if anyone ever wants to get in touch with me as well, I love chatting about this stuff. So if further recommendations or reading lists, I'd always love to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I've been very grateful to get to sit down and chat about this stuff. It's fascinating how it's evolving, what we can do with talking about alienation, turning these, seemingly maybe not very nice on the surface things into explorations and into healing and into catharsis. I think it's a really beautiful way to use writing, which is what it's all about. Or it's about, doing a slasher and everyone has a great read and we're done, whatever it is we're doing.
Or both.
Or both. Gosh, if you can do both, get in touch. We'd like to hear about it. Amazing. Well, thank you, Margot. I really appreciate that. And we'll pull to a close there.
Thank you so much. This has been an absolute joy.
A big thank you to Margot Douaihy and Ellie for their time, and to you for listening. If you have any questions or you want to get in touch, you can find us at Writers Centre on Twitter and Instagram. We're on Facebook, and you can sign up to the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk. As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation over on our website by going to the Support Us page. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a rating and a review, because this helps other writers to find us. Thanks again. Keep writing, and I'll catch you on the next episode.